Hello everyone, and I hope you're having a good day. Today we'll explore a story that begins quietly, with nothing out of place until one small assumption turns into a nightmare. A child is expected, a plan is spoken, but no one checks the final step. And before anyone realizes it, little Ly goes missing. Stay with us, subscribe to the channel, and make sure you don't miss what happens next. The morning begins quietly, the kind of quiet that feels ordinary enough to be ignored. In the countryside, mornings do not rush. The air is still, the roads are familiar, and nothing suggests that this day will be any different from the ones before it. Diep wakes up early, already thinking about little Ly. Today is supposed to be simple. She plans to pick little Ly up, spend the day together, and then return her safely in the evening. It is a routine that has happened before, one that feels so normal it barely requires attention. Before leaving, Diep makes a phone call to Ms. Huyen. The call is brief, clear, almost too easy. Ms. Huyen answers calmly and confirms that little Ly is at home. She mentions that the child is sitting on the chair, playing quietly. Everything sounds exactly as it should. No hesitation, no concern, nothing that would make Diep ask further questions. They hang up. At that moment, in Diep's mind, the plan feels complete. The act of picking little Ly up feels as good as done, even though it has not actually happened yet. The risk is subtle, hidden inside an assumption that feels reasonable because it has worked before. Diep leaves the house. On the road back from work, James appears unexpectedly. He has just finished his tasks for the day and is heading home, carrying the tired calm of someone who has been working since early morning. Their meeting is unplanned, casual, the kind that happens naturally in a small place where paths cross without effort. They slow down and walk together for a bit. The conversation starts lightly. James asks about Diep's plans. She mentions little Ly, the day ahead, the idea of spending time together. They talk about work, about crops, about how little Ly has been resting at home lately. James listens, then frowns slightly. He mentions that taking little Ly out might be tiring. The fields can be uncomfortable. Bugs, heat, long hours. He worries out loud that little Ly might get itchy or exhausted. His concern is practical, not emotional. It comes from habit, from familiarity. Then he offers a simple alternative. He says he would rather cook himself today. He wants to prepare a proper meal at home, something warm and easy, something that would suit Diep better after a long day. If little Ly stays at home with Ms. Huyen, the child can rest comfortably and Diep does not need to rush. The suggestion makes sense. Diep hesitates only briefly. In her mind, little Ly is already safe, already under supervision. The plan shifts slightly, but it does not feel like a risk. She agrees, thinking she will inform Ms. Huyen later. It feels like a small delay, nothing urgent. They part ways. The decision is made quietly, without tension, without drama. That is what makes it dangerous. No one marks the moment as important. No one pauses to double-check. Meanwhile, back at Ms. Huyen's house, little Ly remains where she was. The child sits on the chair, playing with her toys, stacking and unstacking pieces in her own small world. She has been told she will be picked up, and she believes it. Children trust words easily, especially when those words come from adults they know. Ms. Huyen is busy preparing to leave for work. She moves through the house with routine efficiency, confident that Diep will arrive soon. The expectation is so firm that it feels unnecessary to verify. Little Ly does not complain. She does not cry. She waits. The house is quiet, but not empty. It is filled with the soft sounds of a child waiting patiently, unaware that time is beginning to stretch in the wrong direction. Around midday, Mr. Huan returns home. He notices unfamiliar toys in the house and makes a casual remark, half joking, half curious. he assumes someone must have brought them over earlier. To him, it is a harmless observation, something not worth thinking about twice. Little Ly hears part of it. Children do not process words the way adults do. She catches fragments, tones, ideas, and fills in the gaps with imagination. In her mind, the presence of unfamiliar toys and unfamiliar words forms a simple conclusion. There is someone else in the house. Fear does not arrive immediately. It comes as caution, as alertness, as the instinct to protect what she believes belongs to her. When Mr. Juan moves around, little Ly watches carefully, trying to make sense of the situation using the limited logic available to her. Later, something unexpected happens. Little Ly confronts Mr. Juan in her own way. She tells him to raise his hands. The command is serious, even if her voice is small. She believes she is doing the right thing, protecting her space, protecting her toys. Mr. Juan is stunned. He does not understand what is happening at first. The situation is absurd, almost humorous, but there is discomfort beneath the confusion. He explains that this is his house, that there is no danger, but little Ly does not accept it easily. Their conversation does not align. Two realities fail to meet. What makes the moment unsettling is not the misunderstanding itself, but the fact that little Ly is alone. Elsewhere, Diep is busy with work. She spends the afternoon harvesting corn, boiling it, preparing it for sale. The signal is weak. Calls do not go through easily. Messages are delayed or unanswered. In her mind, little Ly is safe. James cooks at home, focusing on preparing a proper meal. He moves with intention, thinking about Diep, about the evening ahead. At one point, he notices that Diep does not mention little Ly, but the absence feels minor, not enough to trigger concern. Evening approaches quietly. When Diep returns home, she feels an unexpected emptiness. The house feels different without the presence of a child. She tells herself little Ly must still be with Ms. Huyen. The explanation is comforting enough to accept without resistance. James suggests going out briefly, changing the atmosphere. Diep agrees, still unaware that the foundation of the day has already cracked. Everything that follows will come from this moment, not from a mistake made loudly, but from a plan that was spoken, assumed, and never completed. The evening settled in quietly, the kind of calm that usually brought relief after a long day. Diep moved around the house on autopilot, placing things down, picking them up again, her mind still replaying the morning. Something felt off, but she couldn't immediately name it. There was no noise from little Ly, no small footsteps, no scattered toys. The silence felt heavier than it should have. James noticed it too. He had suggested earlier that they go out, just the two of them, a simple break from routine. Diep had agreed too easily, almost as if she were trying to outrun a feeling rather than confront it. Now, as she stood by the table, she paused and looked around again. "She's probably with my mom," Diep said, more to herself than to James. "She likes staying there." James nodded, but he didn't respond right away. He had learned not to rush moments like this. "If that's the case," he said calmly, "we can still go later." Diep forced a small smile. "Yeah, it's fine." Her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and froze for half a second before answering. The caller ID read, "Mom." "Hello," Diep said. "Diep," Ms. Huyen's voice came through clearly. "I wanted to ask you something." Diep straightened instinctively. "Yes, Mom?" "I was cleaning up the house," Ms. Huyen said, "and little Ny's toy set is still here, the one she always takes with her." Diep frowned. "That's strange. She should have it." There was a brief pause on the line. "That's what I thought," Ms. Huyen replied. "Did you forget to take it when you picked her up?" Diep's chest tightened. "When I picked her up?" "Yes," Ms. Huyen said slowly. You called this morning and said you were coming." The room felt suddenly smaller. Diep's grip on the phone tightened. "Mom," she said carefully, "little Ly isn't with you?" "No," Ms. Huyen answered. "I assumed she left with you." The words didn't land all at once. They fell one by one, each heavier than the last. James was already watching her face. He didn't interrupt. He just waited. "Mom?" Diep said again, her voice quieter now. "Little Ly isn't with me either." Silence. "What do you mean?" Ms. Huyen asked. "I didn't come," Diep said. I thought she was still there." On the other end of the line, Ms. Huyen's breathing changed. "She was sitting on the chair this morning," she said, trying to piece it together. "I had things to do. I thought you'd already taken her." Diep felt her stomach drop. "No," she whispered. "I didn't." James stepped closer, his expression shifting instantly from concern to focus. "Mom," Diep said, forcing herself to stay clear. "Can you check again? Please. Look around the house." "I already did," Ms. Huyen replied, panic creeping into her voice. "She's not here!" Diep lowered the phone slightly, her hands shaking. James didn't ask questions. He already knew. "She's not there," Diep said, looking at him. "She's not with me. No one picked her up." James took the phone gently from her. "Mom," he said, his voice steady but firm. "Stay where you are. Check the yard, the front gate, everywhere nearby. We're coming right now." He ended the call and immediately grabbed his keys. Diep stood frozen. Her mind raced backward through the day, replaying every moment, every decision. The phone call, the conversation with James, the assumption she never confirmed. "I should have told her," Diep said, her voice breaking. "I should have called back. I should have checked." James placed his hands on her shoulders. "We'll deal with that later," he said. "Right now, we move." They drove fast but carefully, the road stretching endlessly in front of them. Diep stared out the window, whispering little Ny's name under her breath, over and over, as if saying it enough times might pull her back into view. When they arrived at Ms. Huyen's house, the lights were on, the gate wide open. Ms. Huyen stood in the yard, her face pale. "She's not here," she said immediately. "I swear, she was here this morning." James nodded. "Okay," he said. "Let's retrace." They split naturally, without discussion. Ms. Huyen checked inside again. James moved toward the neighboring houses. Diep walked toward the road, calling little Ny's name, her voice growing hoarse. The village felt different at night. Sounds carried farther. Shadows stretched longer. Every rustle made her turn her head. "Little Ny," Diep called. "It's me." No answer. Minutes passed, then more. Time stretched painfully. A neighbor stepped out, drawn by the noise. "What's going on?" he asked. James explained quickly. "Have you seen a little girl today, around noon?" The neighbor hesitated. "I saw Mr. Huan earlier," he said. "He came back around midday." Diep's head snapped up. "Mr. Huan?" "Yes," the neighbor said. "He went home, that's all I know." Diep felt a sudden chill. A memory surfaced. Little details she hadn't given weight to before. Mr. Huan's house, the toys, a child's misunderstanding. "James!" she said urgently. "Mr. Huan's place. We should check." James didn't question it. "Mom," he said to Ms. Huyen, "stay here. We'll go." They moved quickly, their footsteps echoing on the dirt path. Diep's heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. As they approached Mr. Huan's house, the lights were dim. The door was closed. James knocked firmly. "Mr. Huan," he called. "It's James." No response. He knocked again, louder. Inside, there was movement. The door opened slowly. Mr. Huan stood there, confused. "James," he said. "What's wrong?" James didn't waste time. "Mr. Juan, have you seen little Ly today?" Mr. Juan frowned. "Little Ly?" He paused, thinking. "There was a child earlier. She thought I was stealing her toys." Diep's breath caught. "She was here?" Mr. Juan nodded. "Yes, she was very serious about it." James and Diep exchanged a look, hope and fear colliding at once. "Where is she now?" Diep asked. Mr. Juan hesitated. "I thought she went home. I was outside for a bit." Diep felt her knees weaken. James steadied her immediately. "Which direction did she go?" James asked. Mr. Juan pointed vaguely toward the fields. "That way, I think." James took out his phone. "We need more people." Within minutes, calls were made. Voices rose in the distance. Flashlights flickered on. The search widened. Diep stood at the edge of the path, staring into the dark, her voice barely audible as she called little Ly's name again. This time, the silence felt unbearable. The night pressed in around them as the search continued, every second stretching longer than the last. And somewhere in the darkness, little Ly was still missing. This story follows a quiet countryside day that slowly unravels into fear. Diep plans to pick up little Ly, calls Ms. Huyen, and assumes everything is settled. On the road, Diep meets James, changes plans, and delays the pickup without confirming. Meanwhile, little Ly waits alone, trusting adults will return. A harmless misunderstanding with Mr. Juan adds tension, while Diep works believing Ly is safe. Evening arrives, and absence turns into unease. A phone call from Ms. Huyen exposes the truth. No one picked little Ly up. Panic spreads as assumptions collapse. James reacts decisively, organizing the search, while Diep battles guilt and fear. Neighbors recall seeing Mr. Juan leading them toward a fragile clue. The story ends with a desperate nighttime search, unanswered calls, and the haunting question of whether little Ly is safe when hope feels painfully distant.